Today's scripture comes from Luke chapter 24, beginning with verse 13. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you not the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before our God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread, he blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem and found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. So I'm going to ask you this morning, if you saw the video on Facebook, I asked you to think about if you had ever had a celebrity sighting. What celebrities have you seen at whatever times? Occasionally you will hear folks who will run into celebrities in airports or restaurants or maybe somewhere else. I had some friends who were on a mission experience a couple of years ago in South Africa, and we're in a cafe there where Prince Harry was actually eating lunch. Being Americans and not Brits, they were a little more obnoxious than the normal protocol with the royal family. As for my own celebrity sightings, I saw Tito Jackson coming out of a Quiznos sub shop in the Bahamas years ago. We did not have time to chat, in case you were wondering. And then there was that odd experience I told some of you about a month or so, or a couple months now, about the lunch I had in Talkeetna, Alaska, when I think my family had lunch with some famous person who we never could pinpoint exactly who he was. You may have your own celebrity sightings, and I'll invite you, if you want, to pop those over into the chat feature of Zoom, but just don't get lost from the rest of the sermon. Today's story from Luke is about a celebrity sighting of sorts. Being the readers of the story today, we already know the punchline. We know who this guy is. We know who this man who comes to them on incognito is. But the two travelers on the road to Emmaus were not so fortunate. According to Luke, this event happens on Easter afternoon. If you'll remember last week's text from John reports that the evening of Easter night, Jesus appears to his disciples and shows them his nail-scarred hands and pierced side, while they are all locked up in a room together. In fact, the Gospels are rich with stories about what happens after the resurrection. Sometimes we get so caught up in the Easter story that we stop at the risen Christ in the empty tomb, but we forget that a whole community had to absorb exactly what was happening here. And then they had to assimilate this new information into their daily world. So here we are in this story on the road to Emmaus. Depending on your translation, many will translate the distance of Emmaus as about 7 miles from Jerusalem. The text doesn't tell us at first who these two people are on the road, but later we learn it's Cleopas and a companion. The companion could have been a friend, or there's a good chance it could have been Cleopas's wife. And the text doesn't give us any clues on exactly why they were heading to Emmaus. Were they headed home after witnessing that awful scene in Jerusalem? Were they trying to head for the hills so they wouldn't get caught in the fray of being associated with this guy, this Jesus whom they had just killed? Were they simply headed back to their jobs and plans in hopes of returning just to something normal again? But we know what they were thinking about this thing we know that they were thinking about this thing that had just happened in Jerusalem. When the stranger meets them, he says, "What are you discussing with each other?" This would make a great scene in a movie because I suspect more was communicated by their facial expressions between one another than anything else. Luke reports that they looked at each other and had to be thinking, who is this guy? And Luke reports that they were sad and then said to him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's taken place there these days?" Surely they wondered, what's wrong with this guy? The whole world has turned upside down. And think about around our area, anytime a snow is coming through the area, rarely do you have a conversation in the days leading up to it that someone doesn't talk about the snow coming in. Or think about if you were to have something like a coronavirus pandemic come through. How many conversations do you have these days that don't reference this pandemic in some way? The same was true for those walking through the road to Emmaus. Their whole world was consumed by this conversation about Jesus of Nazareth. And they're sad about it. Whatever their reason for heading to Emmaus, they cannot leave behind this previous experience. Frederick Buechner, noted theologian, writes, "Emmaus is whatever we do or wherever we go to make ourselves forget that the world holds nothing sacred, that even the wisest and bravest and loveliest decay and die." That's a depressing statement, but it's true. There are places we go that are our Emmauses, that are the places where we head for the hills, where we try to get out of town, where we try to head away from death and head away from the place and event that held so much promise. They're in the process of trying to forget what happened. They're trying to make sense of their hopes that were dashed. And in that encounter, when they tell Jesus or the stranger all that had happened, they say to Jesus, "But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." They tell the stranger about how he was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. This was the one they had waited for. Now he was gone. Their hopes dashed and their fears realized. And so they take this walk to Emmaus. We've all been in places where our hopes are dashed and our fears realized. Things that didn't work out as we planned or assumed, and we're headed to Emmaus, the place where we can forget all that. In those times, encountering the sacred is the thing we want most, yet sometimes it's the thing we most resist. That was true for these two on the road to Emmaus. Luke reports their eyes were kept from recognizing Jesus. Sometimes the disillusionment of the world can keep our eyes from seeing Jesus. The world looks a little more scary or confusing, and those things fill our space much more easily. Jesus sometimes appears right in our midst, and we fail to see him. After walking this path with Jesus and telling their stories, Jesus chastises them for not interpreting the events that were happening in light of the testimony of Scripture. By the point where they've both exchanged their stories, they've reached this little town of Emmaus. Jesus starts walking ahead of them. It was customary for people to invite a guest multiple times before they would agree to enter their home and stay there. So Jesus wasn't about to invite himself to their little party. But imagine at this point, if these two, Cleopas and his companion, had thought the stranger just a little too much and allowed him to continue his walk on, they would never have encountered Jesus. But their curiosity is just enough and their hospitality high that they invite Jesus in. And here, they entertain Jesus unaware. Here, they've arrived at their Emmaus, their place of escape from the troubles they experienced, and they invite a stranger into their home. And here's when the aha moment happens. Jesus sits at the table with them. He takes bread at the table. He breaks it. He blesses it, and he gives it. In this simple action, their eyes are open. Their eyes are open in this new ritual that Jesus has just brought about a few days earlier. That he is the very bread of life. Jesus also took bread and broke it and gave it to feed 5,000. He also took bread and broke it and gave it to the disciples at his Passover feast as a symbol of giving his body. But here in this symbol of ritual, their eyes are open and they encounter the risen Christ. In the breaking of the bread, they see Jesus once again. And this time, hopes are realized and fears are dashed. This time, everything they believed to be true about this Messiah, the one to redeem Israel, is now true. But it's bigger. It's bigger than they could ever have imagined. He didn't come just to redeem Israel. He came to redeem all people. He came to bring hope and life to a world for everyone. And even though Jesus disappears after the breaking of the bread and the realization that it's him, they still know the power of the risen Lord in their midst. They recall how different the conversation was while walking in his presence on their way to Emmaus. They went to Emmaus to escape, and yet there they were found. They may not have recognized him as Jesus, but they knew something was different about this man on that walk. And it says that their hearts were burning within them. And their response at this point? They weren't going to stay in Emmaus. They turn around and they head back to Jerusalem. Remember, according to the passage, it's already evening and they are 7 miles away. They are so altered by their encounter with the risen Christ, they don't want to sleep on it or think about it a few days. This time they are ready to leave Emmaus, their place of escape, and head right back into Jerusalem. Fear is waning, hope is rising, and they have a story to tell. They show up where the disciples are and tell the 11 and their companions what happened on the road and how Jesus had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. And here's where Luke's story merges with John from last week. Jesus appears to them and shows his hands and his feet. We have a lot to learn from these Emmaus travelers. We can empathize with them that sometimes we too try to escape to Emmaus. Sometimes we try to run away and make sense of the world. We try to forget all that has happened. And in those moments, sometimes we are so blinded by our disillusionment that we fail to see Jesus. But God always meets us where we are, reminds us of God's promises, and points us back to Jerusalem, the pathway home. I've traveled the road to Emmaus before, and in retrospect, see that God met me many times on the road. I've traveled to the place of Emmaus where I was trying to escape, trying to leave behind the things that I thought were true. But God encounters all of us on that road with people to make me more aware of the divine presence walking alongside. God used those Emmaus roads in my own life to turn me back around and point me back to my calling. I hope for all of us, when we do that turnaround in Emmaus, we do so with the urgency of Cleopas and his companion, who made their way in a 7-mile moonlit run back to Jerusalem. Their hearts were burning, their spirits were excited, and they could not help but run and tell the rest of them what they had encountered. Such is our task as well. When we encounter Jesus in the ordinary, everyday moments of life, the places where we least expect it, our challenge is to turn around and head back to tell others, to reorient ourselves, to tell the story once again. Today, I'm wondering what part of the Emmaus road you are walking. Are you headed towards Emmaus, or are you headed towards Jerusalem? Are you headed towards some place of escape, disillusioned by the world, and feeling a little less hopeful? And if so, how might you open your eyes to Jesus? What strangers might you encounter who will suddenly remind you of the risen Christ? Or today, are you on the road from Emmaus back to Jerusalem? Are you returning to a place to reorient your faith, to tell this story of the Jesus you have encountered? The truth is, we will all walk the road to Emmaus and back a few times in our faith journey. But I pray we will always be found faithful in opening our eyes to encounter the risen Christ among us. And when we do, I pray we are faithful in turning in the moonlight and running and quickening our feet so that we might tell the world again and again and again, Christ is risen and it has changed my life forever. May it be so. Join me as we pray.